The rope bit into her wrists, a rough, final truth. It had worn the skin to a weeping red that gathered dust from the wind. The dust was a constant thing here, a pale brown ghost that coated everything, the warped planks of the saloon porch, the dry trough, the faces of the men who stared and the women who looked away. She stood tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town, a piece of damaged goods returned to sender, only the sender was 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. She had been bought and brought, a name on a ledger, a promise in a letter full of words thin as autumn smoke. Then she had been found wanting. Not strong enough for the work, not pretty enough for the pride, not quiet enough in her own sorrow. So the man, a beefy rancher named Barlow with hands like cured hams and a laugh that sounded like rocks in a barrel, had dragged her back to town. He declared the deal broken. He wanted his money back, but there was no one to give it to him. So he tied her to the post. $5 he had boomed an hour ago, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed near her bare feet. $5 for a strong back, if not a pretty face. Got a good set of teeth, anyway. No one had moved. The price had dropped to $3. Then $1. Now there was no price. There was only the heat, the rope, and the slow, grinding humiliation of being looked at like a lame horse. The crowd had mostly lost interest. A few men still lingered on the saloon porch, nursing warm beers. A dog slept in the sliver of shade cast by the undertaker's office. The world had gone on around her, leaving her staked to its cruel center. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in the post, a single, rusted point in a universe of indifference. She had learned this trick long ago, find the smallest thing and cling to it. The nail. The splintered would grain around it. The way the unforgiving sun made it glint like a dull, forgotten star. She did not cry. Tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. They had been wrung out of her long before this post, this rope, this town. All she had left was a silence that was dense and heavy, a shield she held up against the world. Then a shadow fell over her. It was different from the shadow of the buildings which had crept slowly across the dusty street as the sun arced west. This was the shadow of a man. It was tall and still. She did not look up. Looking up was an invitation, a question. She had no more questions to ask of this world. From the edge of the square, Elias had watched. He had come to town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when the stores in his cabin ran so low they echoed. He hated the town. It was a place of noise and judgment, of eyes that measured a man's worth by the dust on his hat and the wear on his boots. His were worn clean through in places. He had seen the woman tied to the post when he first rode in. He had seen the laughing, jeering face of Barlow, a man known for his cruelty and his pride. Elias had turned away, his jaw a hard line beneath his beard. It was not his business. The world was full of casual cruelties he could not mend. He had a whole homestead of things he could not mend. Section he went about his tasks, his movements deliberate and slow. He bought his flour from the mercantile, the clerk's eyes lingering on the haunted stillness in his face. He bought his salt. He stood for a moment, the heavy sacks in his hands, and felt the familiar pull of his own isolation, the quiet cabin and the 2 graves on the hill behind it. That was his world. There was no room in it for another person's pain. He had enough of his own to carry. But as he prepared to leave, his gaze was drawn back to the center of the square. The crowd was gone. Barlow was back on the saloon porch, laughing with his friends. The woman was still there. The sun was beating down on her uncovered head. Her dress, a thing of cheap, faded calico, was torn at the shoulder. She had not moved. She just stood, tied, a monument to a broken promise. Something in him, a piece of rusted machinery deep in his chest, gave a painful lurch. It was the stillness. The way she accepted the rope, the sun, the humiliation, as if they were nothing more than the weather. It was a stillness he recognized. It was the stillness of a field after a fire has burned through, leaving nothing behind but black earth and silence. He dropped the sacks by his horse and walked across the empty square. His boots made no sound in the thick dust. He stopped in front of Barlow, who looked up, his face flushed with drink. "Well now, Elias. Come to look at the merchandise." Barlow slurred, gesturing with his beer. Elias's eyes, the color of a winter sky, did not flicker. He looked past Barlow to the woman. He did not speak to her, or even truly at her. He spoke to the space between them, a quiet declaration aimed at the whole sorry town. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low and rough, like it had been pulled up from under floorboards. Barlow blinked, then let out that rock-barrel laugh. "Take her? Hell, she's yours for the trouble of untying her." Was about to cut her loose and let the coyotes have her. Elias did not acknowledge the laughter. He reached into his worn leather pouch and pulled out a single, dull coin. It was not much, but it was not nothing. It was a transaction. He placed it on the porch rail next to Barlow's hand. The coin made a small, definitive sound against the wood. It was the sound of a debt being settled, though whose debt and for what was unclear. Then he turned and walked to the post. She felt the shadow return, and this time a flicker of something sharp, fear, maybe pierced the thick wool of her resignation. She heard the soft clink of the coin, the gruff laughter, and then the sound of boots in the dust coming closer. She squeezed her eyes shut. He did not speak. She heard the faint scrape of metal on leather as he pulled a knife from a sheath at his belt. The blade glinted for a second in the sun. She flinched, a small, involuntary tightening of her whole body. She expected a new kind of pain. Instead, she felt a slight sawing tension on the rope at her right wrist, and then a sudden release. The pressure was gone. The rope fell away, limp and useless. He moved to her other wrist and did the same. The second rope fell. Her hands were free. They dropped to her sides, heavy and numb. The blood returning to them was a fire of pins and needles. She stood there, untethered but unmoving, her head bowed. The man stepped back, giving her space. He did not touch her. He did not tell her to move. He simply waited, a tall, quiet shadow in the oppressive heat. After a long moment that stretched thin as a sigh, she slowly, painfully, lifted her head. She saw worn boots, dusty trousers, a coat that had seen 100 storms. She saw hands calloused and capable, one of them still holding the knife, blade pointed safely toward the ground. Finally, she looked at his face. It was weathered, carved by sun and grief, and his eyes held a sorrow so deep it looked like home. The journey back to his land was a study in silence. He led his horse, the sacks of flour and salt slung over its back. She walked a few paces behind him. The dust lifted behind them like tired ghosts. He did not look back to see if she was following. He seemed to assume she would, that she had nowhere else to go. He was right. The sun beat down and the landscape was a harsh, unforgiving canvas of cracked earth and skeletal sagebrush. The wind was a dry, hot breath that stole the moisture from her skin. Her bare feet, already tender, began to protest against the sharp stones and hot ground. She said nothing, only shortened her stride, her gaze fixed on the steady, rhythmic movement of his retreating back. After an hour, he stopped. Without turning, he unhooked a canteen from his saddle. He uncorked it, drank, then held it out behind him. She hesitated for a beat, her heart giving a suspicious thump. Kindness was a language she no longer trusted, but thirst was a more immediate truth. She stepped forward and took the canteen. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, impersonal contact, but his skin was warm. The water was cool and tasted of metal and earth. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, then handed it back. He corked it and hung it back on the saddle, and they started walking again. It was the only exchange between them. They arrived as dusk was bleeding blood orange and violet across the western sky. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and time. It stood alone in a slight dip in the land, flanked by a leaning barn and a tangled patch of what might have once been a garden. It was not a place of comfort, it was a place of survival. It looked as worn and tired as the man who called it home. Behind the cabin, on a small rise overlooking the vast, empty prairie, were 2 mounds of earth, each marked with a simple wooden cross. One was weathered and gray, the other newer, though it still pale. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He led the horse to the barn, unsaddled it, and gave it water and grain. She stood by the cabin door, a stranger on the threshold of a stranger's life, her arms wrapped around herself as a small, cool breeze began to stir. He emerged from the barn and walked to the cabin, pushing the door open. It creaked, a low groan of protest. He went inside without a word. She remained outside. The thought of being in another enclosed space, another man's space, made the air in her lungs feel thin and tight. She could run. She could disappear into the coming night. But the prairie stretched out in every direction, an ocean of grass and predators, and her feet were already bleeding. He reappeared in the doorway, blocking the faint light from within. He was holding a bowl. He set it down on the porch step. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of boiled potatoes and salt. Next to it, he placed a tin cup of water and a piece of coarse, dark bread. Then he went back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. It was not an invitation. It was a provision, an unspoken contract. Here is food. Here is shelter. I will not force you. She stared at the bowl for a long time as the last of the light died and the stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Finally, her hunger won out over her fear. She sat on the step, her back to the open door, and ate. The potatoes were lumpy and undersalted, but they were hot. They were real. When she finished, she crept inside. The main room was small and spare. A stone fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, a cot in the corner where a bedroll was laid out. A single lantern cast a warm, flickering glow over everything, making the shadows dance. The man was asleep on the cot, one arm flung over his face, already lost to the world. Against the far wall was another door, closed. She knew, instinctively, that she was not to open it. Her space was here, in the main room. He had left a worn but clean blanket folded at the foot of the table. He had not locked the door. He had claimed her, brought her here, and then set her free inside the walls of his own prison. She took the blanket, curled up on the floor by the hearth where the embers still pulsed with a dull red heat, and for the first time in a year, she slept without fear of a hand in the dark. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. It was a quiet life, measured in small, necessary actions. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would go out to the barn and she would hear the distant, rhythmic sound of him chopping wood or mending a fence rail. She, in turn, would rise and begin her own work. At first, she was hesitant, unsure of her place. She started by sweeping the floor of the cabin, the soft brush of the straw broom a whispering sound in the morning stillness. She washed the 2 bowls and 2 cups they used, setting them to dry on a worn cloth. These were small acts, offerings into the silence. He never told her what to do. He simply did what needed to be done, and she observed, and then she found a way to help. When she saw him struggling to patch the leaky roof of the barn with clumsy, thick-fingered stitches of tar and canvas, she found a needle and thread in a small wooden box of his late wife's things. A box she only touched after 3 days of deliberation, and she mended the tears in his work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He never mentioned the mended shirts, but the next morning, he left a pair of his wife's old leatherwork gloves on the table for her. They were too big, but they saved her hands from the rough wood of the fence posts she helped him set. They worked in parallel, 2 solitary planets orbiting the same dying star of a homestead. She learned the language of his movements. The hard set of his shoulders meant frustration with a stubborn mule. The slow, methodical way he cleaned his tools meant a quiet satisfaction in a day's work done. He, in turn, learned the map of her silences. He knew the tight, brittle silence that meant she was remembering and the softer, more porous silence that meant she was simply watching the clouds drift by. One afternoon, while she was pulling weeds from the sad, neglected garden patch, her hand closed around a single, stubborn wildflower that had survived. It was a tough, purple thing, no bigger than her thumb. On impulse, she carried it up the small hill to the 2 graves. She looked at the newer cross, the one with the name Sarah carved into it. The carving was rough, an act of love and grief, not craftsmanship. She hesitated, then gently pushed the stem of the wildflower into the soft earth at the base of the cross. A small, bright spot of color against the faded brown. When he came in for supper that evening, he was quieter than usual. He did not look at her, but she knew he had seen it. The silence in the cabin that night was different. It was not empty. It was full of the ghost of a purple flower. A week later, he tried to bake bread. The result was a dense, smoky brick that could have stunned a rabbit at 20 paces. He set it on the table between them with a heavy thud. She looked at it. He looked at it. A little dry, he said, his voice flat. She almost smiled. It was the closest they had come to a shared joke. The next day, using his flour, she baked a loaf. It was light and soft with a perfectly browned crust. The smell of it filled the small cabin, a scent of warmth and life that seemed to chase the ghosts from the corners. They ate it for supper with a thin stew she had made. He tore off a piece of the bread and chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. "You didn't complain about mine," he said, a dry understatement that was his version of a compliment. That night, a storm rolled in, a great, booming thing that shook the little cabin to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. She was not afraid of the storm itself, but the dark, the rattling door, the feeling of being trapped, it brought back the old fears. She curled tighter in her blanket by the hearth, her body trembling. She must have made a sound, a small whimper that was swallowed by a crack of thunder. In a flash of lightning that bleached the room white, she saw him sit up on his cot. He did not get up. He did not come to her. He simply reached over to the small table beside him and lit the lantern. He turned the flame down low so it cast a soft, steady glow, a small, defiant sun against the raging dark. Then he lay back down. He did not extinguish the light until the storm had passed and the first gray fingers of dawn were creeping over the horizon. The quiet rhythm of their life held a fragile peace, but it was a peace built on unspoken things. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence stretched taut between them. The question had been living in her for weeks, a live thing curled in her chest. She had to ask. Not about why he had taken her, not about the future. About the past that lived and breathed in this house. "Sarah," she said, her voice thin from disuse. It was the first time she had spoken a name in this house. Elias stopped staring into the flames. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "She was your wife," she stated. It was not a question. He nodded slowly. He picked up a small piece of wood and tossed it into the fire, watching the sparks fly up. "And the other grave?" she whispered. His whole body seemed to tighten. For a moment she thought he would not answer. That she had crossed a line, broken the unspoken contract. "Our boy," he said finally, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "Born too soon. Took Sarah with him." The words fell into the silence of the room and stayed there. He had carried whole winters in his eyes, and now she understood why. She saw the two fresh graves, the abandoned garden, the hollowed-out stillness of the man beside her. He had not just lost a wife, he had lost a whole world. She did not offer condolences. Words were useless against a pain that vast. Instead, she reached for the mending basket. She took out one of his shirts, the fabric worn soft as a prayer, and began to stitch a frayed cuff, her movements small and deliberate in the lantern light. It was all she had to offer, the quiet act of putting something back together. He watched her, his gaze following the movement of the needle, and for the first time, the heavy silence between them felt less like an empty space and more like a shared burden. The peace was broken by the dust. A plume of it far out on the prairie rising against the clear blue sky. It was too much dust for a lone rider, too purposeful for the wind. Elias saw it first. He was on the roof of the barn, finally replacing the last of the rotten shingles, and he froze, a silhouette against the sun. He stood there for a long minute, watching the dust cloud grow, a malignant spot on the horizon. He climbed down the ladder, his movements economical and grim. He did not run. He walked to the cabin, his face set in hard lines she had not seen since that first day in town. "Go inside," he said. It was not a request. She did not argue. She saw the look in his eyes. She went into the cabin, but she did not hide. She stood by the small, grimy window and watched as the dust cloud resolved into 3 riders. They were coming straight for the homestead. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that was cold and sharp as ice, who it was. Barlow rode in the center, his bulk spilling over his saddle. He had 2 men with him, rough-looking hands who stayed a respectful distance behind him. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, turning the patch of earth into a battleground. Elias stood before the porch, his feet planted, his hands empty at his sides. He looked small and solitary against the vastness of the land, but he did not look afraid. "Elias," Barlow called, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "I've come for my property." "She's not your property," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. Barlow laughed, that same ugly sound she remembered. "I think she is. A deal's a deal, but I got to thinking. You paid me a pittance. An insult, really? I've decided I want her back. She has a contract to fulfill." He looked past Elias, his eyes fixing on the cabin window where she stood. "Come on out, girl. Your owner is here." The word owner struck her like a physical blow. It was meant to strip her of everything she had slowly, painstakingly begun to gather around herself, the quiet dignity of her work, the safety of the unspoken rules, the fragile sense of self. It was meant to turn her back into the object tied to the post. Inside the cabin, her blood ran cold, then hot. The trembling started in her hands again, but this time it was not from fear. It was from a rage so pure and white-hot it burned away the last vestiges of the victim she had been. She looked around the small room, the swept floor, the mended shirt folded on the table, the hearth she banked every night. This was her place. She had earned it. Elias did not move. "You left her," he said, his voice still level. "You tied her to a post and left her. The deal is done. Ride on." "I don't think so," Barlow sneered, shifting his weight in the saddle. He nodded to one of his men. "Go get her." The man started to dismount, but before his boot hit the ground, Elias moved. He did not draw a weapon. He simply took 2 steps forward, closing the distance, placing his body squarely between the rider and the cabin door. It was a simple, absolute statement. "You will not pass." The rider hesitated, looking back at Barlow. And then the cabin door creaked open. She stepped out onto the porch. She was not holding a weapon. Her hands were empty, just as his were. Her dress was clean, her hair was tied back, and her face was scrubbed. She looked, for the first time, like a woman who belonged somewhere. She did not look at Barlow. She looked at Elias's back. At the solid, unmoving line of his shoulders. Barlow's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in anger. He had expected a cowering, terrified creature to be dragged out. He had not expected this quiet, defiant woman to emerge on her own. "There you are," he said, forcing a smile. "Now be a good girl and come here. We're leaving this sad little scrap of earth." She took another step, coming to stand beside Elias. Not behind him, but beside him. They stood together, two quiet figures against the three mounted men. She lifted her chin and finally met Barlow's gaze. Her own was clear and steady. She said nothing. Her silence was more powerful than any shouted defiance. It was not the silence of a victim anymore. It was the silence of a judge. Said, "I see you. I know what you are. And you have no power here." Barlow's face purpled with rage. The calm refusal of these two broken people was an affront to his pride, more infuriating than any armed resistance. He had come expecting to swagger and take what he wanted. He had not come prepared for dignity. "Damn you both," he spat, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip. "You draw that," Elias said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "and you'll be the third man I've buried on that hill." There was no boast in his tone. It was a statement of fact, as plain and hard as the ground they stood on. Barlow looked from Elias's cold, winter sky eyes to the woman's unblinking stare. He saw the two graves on the hill. He saw the unyielding unity of the two people before him. They were stitched together with something stronger than rope or contracts. He was a bully and a coward. He had come for an easy prize, not a fight to the death over a matter of pride. With a frustrated curse, he wrenched his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. They disappeared back into the prairie, leaving behind only a fading cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence. The dust settled. The threat was gone. The vast, empty prairie was theirs again. Elias stood frozen for a long moment, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders. He turned his head and looked at her. His face was pale beneath his tan, his eyes full of a storm of emotions she could not name. He had been ready to kill for her. He had been ready to die for her. She met his gaze, and in that shared look, everything that had been unspoken between them was finally said. Gratitude. Respect. A fierce, protective loyalty. The foundation of their new world settled into place, solid and unshakable. He gave a short, sharp nod as if to himself. Then he turned and walked into the cabin. She heard the sound of him stoking the fire, the familiar, comforting scrape of metal on stone. She followed him inside, closing the door on the wide, empty world. The small room felt like a sanctuary. The silence that fell between them was no longer a void, it was a blanket, warm and safe. It was the sound of home. The confrontation with Barlow had changed the air in the cabin. The silence that had once been a space between them was now a bond that held them together. The unspoken contract of provision and shelter had been fulfilled and broken all at once, replaced by something deeper, something forged in the fire of that shared defiance on the porch. A few nights later, they sat at the table, the light from the lantern casting long shadows on the log walls. The meal was over, but neither of them moved. The fire crackled in the hearth, a low, steady heartbeat. It was Elias who spoke, his voice quiet in the dim room. "I've been calling you woman in my head all this time," he said, not looking at her, but at his own calloused hands resting on the table. "That's not right. You're not just woman." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. "I never asked your name." She had been nameless for so long. She had been girl, property, a number in a ledger, a whispered slur. The man who had bought her letter had never used her name, as if saying it would make her too real. To be asked for it now felt like being handed the key to her own soul. Her throat was tight. She swallowed once. "Lena," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the stillness of the cabin it sounded as loud as a bell. "Lena," he repeated, testing the shape of it on his tongue. He nodded slowly. "It's a good name." The saying of it, the hearing of it, was a quiet cataclysm. It was the moment she stopped being the sum of what had been done to her and became herself again. Lena. She let the sound of it fill her up. The next morning she woke with a new sense of purpose. She took the ragged, dirty dress she had arrived in, the one that clung to her like a shroud of her old life. She carried it outside to the burn pile behind the barn. Without ceremony, she dropped it onto the ashes and struck a match. The dry, flimsy cotton caught at once, flaring up in a bright, hungry flame. She watched until it was nothing but black, curling wisps that lifted on the breeze and disappeared into the vast blue sky. A fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Later that day, she found him by the dilapidated fence that bordered the failed garden. He was trying to straighten a warped post. She came and stood beside him, picking up the coil of wire he'd been struggling with. He showed her how to loop and tighten it, his large, rough hands guiding her smaller ones without touching them. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, synchronized rhythm. They were not just mending a fence. They were building an enclosure, defining a space in the wild world that was theirs. When they finished, they stood back and looked at their work. The fence was still crooked and patched, but it was strong. "It'll hold," he said. She nodded. "Yes, it will." The house began to breathe again. She hung a bundle of dried herbs by the window, their faint, spicy scent mingling with the wood smoke. He fixed the broken rocker that had sat in a corner collecting dust, and in the evenings she would sometimes sit in it, the gentle motion a quiet comfort. The room that had belonged to Sarah was still closed, a shrine to a grief that needed its own space, but the rest of the house was slowly, carefully coming back to life. It was no longer his house or a place she was staying. It was becoming their home. One evening, a month later, they were sitting on the porch steps watching the sunset. The sky was a riot of pink and gold, and the prairie was bathed in a soft, gentle light. The silence between them was easy now, as comfortable as a well-worn blanket. It was a silence filled with the shared work of the day, the taste of the supper they had eaten, the simple, solid presence of each other. He cleared his throat. "The preacher comes through on a circuit once a year," he said to the horizon. "He'll be through this territory in a week or two." He paused, picking at a splinter on the wooden step. "People will talk less if we're married." Lena looked at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the weariness that was still etched around his eyes but was softer now. He was offering her his name, a shield against the world's judgment. But it was more than that. It was a promise. A future. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," she said softly, "or the most foolish." A faint smile touched his lips, a rare and startling thing. "Can't I be both?" She thought of the journey here, of the bowl of food on the step, of the lantern left burning in the storm, of him standing between her and the man who called her property. She thought of him asking her name. "Yes," she said, her voice full and steady. "I think you can." He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she no longer saw just the ghosts of winter. She saw the first, tentative green shoots of a spring he thought would never come again. He had taken in a broken woman to help work his land, thinking he was the rescuer. But in giving her a place to be safe, he had built a shelter for himself. In watching her heal, he had learned how to do the same. She reached out and laid her hand on the rough wood of the step next to his. Her fingers were inches from his. A small space full of a vast and unspoken promise. The house was quiet behind them, its rooms filled with the soft, even breathing of a new and tender life. This story, it isn't just about a cowboy and a bride. It isn't really about rescue at all. Rescue is a single, sharp moment. Healing is a slow and quiet season. It's about two people scraped raw by the world who were brave enough to stand in the same silence together. It's about the kind of strength you don't find in a fist, but in a hand that mends a shirt or leaves a lantern burning in the dark. We all have our own prairies to cross, our own pasts that tie us to a post. We carry our own silent griefs in houses that have forgotten how to breathe. The world will try to name you, to claim you, to tell you what you are worth. It will try to sell you for $5 or $1 or nothing at all. But the real question is the one that comes after. When the ropes are cut, who do you choose to be? What name do you answer to when it's finally your own? It's not about waiting for a hero to ride in. It's about finding that other soul who sees the piece of unbroken sky in your eyes and isn't afraid of your storms. It's about the quiet courage it takes to plant a single wildflower on a grave, to bake a loaf of bread in a cold kitchen, to stand next to someone, not behind them, when the dust kicks up. If you're lucky, you find someone who will simply stand with you. And if you're brave, you might find that in saving them, you were really just building the home you needed to save yourself.